Let's see. We're going to start off with a real life grandfather frog story about my dad. Happened when I was because as you know, the last time we saw grandfather frog in the story, he had been captured by Farmer Brown's boy and Farmer Brown's boy was going to eat his legs. So when I was about 7 or 8, there was a stream that went into a big pond next to a public park. And I used to walk down there and I would catch frogs. And I would let them go immediately, but the challenge was to capture the frogs, and because they were really hard to catch. Because just like the grandfather frog in the story, as soon as they saw me, they would jump into the water, and I would have to be very very stealthy, and be uh, very cunning in order to catch them. So, back in those days, my dad was on the road a lot for business, so I wouldn't see him for, a month at a time and stuff. And he came home one time, and I told him all about how I had been catching frogs down by the stream. And Dad said, "Oh, that's fantastic. Hey, tell you what, why don't you go catch 4 or 5 frogs for me?" And I thought he wanted me to catch the frogs because he was going to build me a frog pond where I could have, he would build a pond and I could watch the frogs, play in the pond and stuff like this. So I got home and I think it was 4 frogs in a bag. Well, no, in the big fishing net that Dad had. He had told me to put them in there. And I saw when I got home that Dad's fish board was out. Now this was a piece of plywood that Dad had, um, and when he was going to be scaling fish or gutting fish, he would take out this board and he would put it near the hose spigot for the garden hose, and he would skin and he would scale the fish and he would gut them and stuff on this piece of plywood. So I got home and I told Dad, "Oh, I've got the frogs." And I'm looking around thinking, has he started building the pond yet for my frog pond? But no, Dad took the frogs out to the plywood board, the fish board. And let's just say that Dad had French fried frog legs that night for dinner. And he gave one to me, but it turns out that I'm allergic to frog's legs, and I almost had to go to the emergency room. So it was kind of a bad ending to what had started off to be a day full of the thought of that I would end up with my own frog pond. But that was my dad. He liked to eat what he liked to eat. So, all right. So, chapter 15. Grandfather Frog gives up hope. With his legs tied together, hanging head down from the end of a string, Grandfather Frog was being carried he knew not where by Farmer Brown's boy. It was dreadful. Halfway across the Green Meadows, the Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind came dancing along. At first they didn't see Grandfather Frog, but presently one of them, rushing up to tease Farmer Brown's boy by blowing off his hat, caught sight of Grandfather Frog. Now, the Merry Little Breezes are great friends of Grandfather Frog. Many, many times they have blown foolish green flies over to him as he sat on his big green lily pad, and they are very fond of him. So when this one caught sight of him in such a dreadful position, he forgot all about teasing Farmer Brown's boy. He raced away to tell the other Merry Little Breezes. For a minute they were perfectly still. They forgot all about being merry. "It's awful, just perfectly awful," cried one. "We must do something to help Grandfather Frog," cried another. "Of course we must," said a third. "But what can we do?" asked a fourth. Nobody replied. They just thought and thought and thought. Finally, the first one spoke. "We must try to comfort him a little," said he. "Of course we will do that," they shouted all together. "And if we throw dust in the face of Farmer Brown's boy and steal his hat, perhaps he will put Grandfather Frog down," continued the Merry Little Breezes. "The very thing!" the others cried, dancing about with excitement. "Then we can rush about and tell all Grandfather Frog's friends what has happened to him and where he is. Perhaps some of them can help us," the Little Breeze continued. They wasted no more time talking, but raced after Farmer Brown's boy as fast as they could go. One of them, who was faster than the others, ran ahead and whispered in Grandfather Frog's ear that they were coming to help him. But poor old Grandfather Frog couldn't be comforted. He couldn't see what there was that the Merry Little Breezes could do. His legs smarted where the string cut into his skin, and his head ached, for, as you know, he was hanging head down. No, sir, Grandfather Frog couldn't be comforted. He was in a terrible fix, and he couldn't see any way out of it. He hadn't the least bit of hope left. And all the time Father Brown's boy was trudging along, whistling merrily. You see, it didn't occur to him to think how Grandfather Frog must be suffering, and how terribly frightened he must be. He wasn't cruel. No, indeed, Farmer Brown's boy wasn't cruel. That is, he didn't mean to be cruel. He was just thoughtless, like a great many other boys, and girls, too. So he went whistling on his way until he reached the long lane leading from the Green Meadows up to Farmer Brown's dooryard. No sooner was he in the long lane than something happened. A great cloud of dust and leaves and tiny sticks was dashed in his face and nearly choked him. Dirt got in his eyes. His hat was snatched from his head and went sailing over into the garden. He dropped Grandfather Frog and felt for his handkerchief to wipe the dirt from his eyes. "Ugh!" exclaimed Farmer Brown's boy as he started after his hat. "It's funny where that wind came up from so suddenly." But you know and I know that it was the Merry Little Breezes working together who made up that sudden wind. And Grandfather Frog ought to have known it too, but he didn't. You see, the dust had got in his nose and eyes just as it had in those of Farmer Brown's boy, and he was so frightened and confused he couldn't think. So he lay just where Farmer Brown's boy dropped him, and he didn't have any more hope than before. Chapter 16. The Merry Little Breezes Work Hard. The Merry Little Breezes almost shouted aloud with delight when they saw Farmer Brown's boy drop Grandfather Frog to feel for his handkerchief and wipe the dust which they had thrown in his eyes. Then he had to climb the fence and chase his hat through the garden. They would let him almost get his hands on it, and then, just as he thought that he surely had it, they would snatch it away. It was great fun for the Merry Little Breezes. But they were not doing it for fun. No, indeed, they were not doing it for fun. They were doing it to lead Farmer Brown's boy away from Grandfather Frog. Just as soon as they dared, they dropped the hat and then separated and rushed away in all directions across the Green Meadows, over to the Green Forest, and down to the Smiling Pool. What were they going for? Why, to hunt for some of Grandfather Frog's friends and ask for their help. You see, the Merry Little Breezes could make Farmer Brown's boy drop Grandfather Frog, but they couldn't untie a knot or cut a string. And this is just what had to be done to set Grandfather Frog free, for his hind legs were tied together. So now they were looking for someone with sharp teeth who thought enough of Grandfather Frog to come and help him. One breeze thought of Striped Chipmunk and started for the old stone wall to look for him. Another went in search of Danny Meadow Mouse. A third headed for the dear old briar patch after Peter Rabbit. A fourth remembered Jimmy Skunk and how he had once set Blacky the Crow free from a snare. A fifth remembered what sharp teeth Happy Jack Squirrel has and hurried over to the Green Forest to look for him. A sixth started straight for the Smiling Pool to tell Jerry Muskrat, and every one of them raced as fast as he could. All this time Grandfather Frog was without hope. Yes, sir, poor old Grandfather Frog was wholly in despair. You see, he didn't know what the Merry Little Breezes were trying to do, and he was so frightened and confused that he couldn't think. When Farmer Brown's boy dropped him, he lay right where he fell for a few minutes. Then, Right close at hand, he saw an old board. Without really thinking, he tried to get to it, for there looked as if there might be room for him to hide under it. It was hard work, for you know his long hind legs, which he uses for jumping, were tied together. The best he could do was crawl and wiggle and pull himself along. Just as Farmer Brown's boy started to climb the fence back into the long lane, his hat in his hand, Grandfather Frog reached the old board and crawled under it. Now, when the Merry Little Breezes had thrown the dust in Farmer Brown's boy's face and snatched his hat, he had dropped Grandfather Frog in such a hurry that he didn't notice just where he did drop him. So now he didn't know the exact place to look for him. But he knew pretty near, and he hadn't the least doubt that he would find him. He had just started to look when the dinner horn sounded. Farmer Brown's boy hesitated. He was hungry. If he was late, he might lose his dinner. He could come back later to look for Grandfather Frog, for with his legs tied, Grandfather Frog couldn't get far. So, with a last look to make sure of the place, Farmer Brown's boy started for the house. If the Merry Little Breezes had known this, they would have felt ever so much better, but they didn't. So they hurried as fast as ever they could to find Grandfather Frog's friends, and worked until they were almost too tired to move, for it seemed as if every single one of Grandfather Frog's friends had taken that particular day to go away from home. So while Farmer Brown's boy ate his dinner and Grandfather Frog lay hiding under the old board in the long lane, the Merry Little Breezes did their best to find help for him. Poor Grandfather Frog. Let's see, the next chapter. Well, I won't tell you what the title of the next chapter is because it would give away the storyline. And that will be it for now, and I'll see you the next time. Thanks, Finn and Liam.